I regret spending much of my youth glued to stations like RFI and France 24, soaking in their narratives without questioning. What Traoré delivered in those few minutes wasn't just a speech, it was a blueprint. Step by step, he laid out exactly how Africa could free itself from the grip of imperialism. No vague slogans, no polished diplomatic lines, just raw, unapologetic truth about what must be done, how to do it, and the price of failing. He began with a bold statement: Africa must fight imperialism the way Russia did. Speaking at the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazism, Traoré described how the celebrations in Moscow were more than history lessons, they were motivation to restart Africa's stalled engine of independence. The Sahel, he reminded, is under heavy imperialist pressure, and the sacrifices of past freedom fighters must guide today's battles. He called for a moment of silence, not just as tribute, but as a warning. To the casual ear, it might have sounded like political theater, a provocative jab meant to rally applause. But the timing, choice of words, and context showed it was far more strategic. Traoré wasn't blindly siding with Russia or picking a fight with the West. He was making a point. Africa must learn from how a sanctioned, cornered, and demonized nation can survive without surrender. When the West hit Russia with crushing sanctions in 2022, every mainstream economist predicted collapse. The ruble would tank, the economy would crumble, and the people would revolt. Instead, Russia fought back with countermeasures, localizing industries, securing non-Western trade partners, and backing its currency with tangible resources. Whether you support Russia or not isn't the issue. Traoré's point was clear: Russia didn't beg for mercy, it built alternatives. This is where Africa has historically failed. Faced with sanctions, coups, IMF conditions, or withdrawn aid, the usual response has been concession, accepting humiliating terms, scaling down ambitions, and waiting for support that comes tied with more control than help. Traoré is urging the opposite: expect the pressure, prepare to operate without Western approval, and build systems that cannot be shut down by outside powers. Fighting imperialism the Russian way isn't about copying Moscow's politics or military, it's about understanding that independence demands self-reliance, even if it means isolation. It's about knowing that real negotiation power comes from survival without the empire's lifeline. His reference to Russia is also a direct challenge to Africa's post-1960s playbook. Look to Europe for funds, to the US for security, to global institutions for validation. That model has failed, and Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are proving that rejecting it does not mean collapse, it can mean rebirth. You begin to detox. This part of his speech wasn't just symbolic, it was calculated. He was sending African leaders a clear message: look at how Russia transformed isolation into independence. Study how they turned sanctions into a weapon of progress. Stop merely complaining about imperialism, learn how to dismantle it. This, he stressed, is only the opening act, because once you reject an empire, you must have the skill and vision to build something in its place. That's where the true challenge begins, and Africa, he warned, cannot rise through theory alone. This is where many so-called independent nations have quietly undermined themselves from within. Let's pause here to give a huge thanks to the Black Culture Diary community, a place where Black voices, stories, and legacies are not only preserved but amplified. By becoming a member, you're doing more than supporting this channel, you're joining a powerful cultural movement. Now, let's continue. I'll share a few examples from my speech to make my point clear. Right now, we are at Mendeleev University, the Dmitry Mendeleev University of Chemical Technology of Russia. The name Mendeleev is known worldwide for his groundbreaking scientific work. Let me tell you a short story. Back in school, when classmates struggled with certain topics, we'd sometimes nickname them after the scientist who discovered that concept. We had our Pavlovs and our Mendeleevs. I loved science myself. You could wake me in the middle of the night and I'd recite the entire periodic table. The same with chemical equations we studied endlessly in secondary school. We mastered them, at least on paper. thermodynamics too. But here's the truth: knowledge on paper is not enough without the means to practice it. Take our current reality. We're at war. We pay for equipment, ammunition, and weapons. Let's talk about ammunition, specifically explosives. Mali produces cotton, as do Burkina Faso and Niger. Cotton cellulose is a key ingredient for gunpowder. So why aren't we making it ourselves? Because we never developed applied chemistry at scale. Look at Russia's missile production, the latest. The Oreshnik had the world buzzing. But behind it is nothing but chemistry and engineering. Africa, meanwhile, holds elections, waves flags, and gives speeches at the UN, yet doesn't control its own production processes. It still imports medicine, energy, soap, and even pencils. The root cause? A missing link: systems that turn knowledge into tangible results. That's what laboratories are for. A lab is more than a room with glass beakers. It's where a nation learns to think through problems, design solutions, and fail repeatedly until success is achieved. This isn't only about chemistry or engineering. Africa has no functioning political laboratories, either no space to test alternative governance, no protected zones to pilot Pan-African trade, no dedicated military research hubs. Instead, every promising idea is funneled through foreign donors, consultants, and global frameworks before it touches African soil. Traoré's message was blunt: we need places to practice. Most of Africa's education is still stuck in colonial molds designed to train followers, not innovators. Students graduate fluent in theory, but powerless in execution. The elite have degrees but no tools. And when a crisis erupts, the first calls go not to local experts, but to Paris, Geneva, or Washington. This is a crisis of design. Breaking free from imperial control requires more than revolutionary slogans. It demands internal systems where ideas are born, tested, and improved. That's why Traoré doesn't just talk about expelling French troops. He talks about building new institutions from the ground up: labs for agriculture, defense, education, medicine, infrastructure, and energy. Most importantly, these labs must be rooted locally, operated hands-on, and protected from foreign meddling, because the real war isn't only fought on battlefields, it's fought in workshops, labs, farms, and factories. If Africa doesn't produce its own engineers, scientists, and problem solvers through practice, it will remain locked in dependency. Traoré knows that once you build your lab, you build your power. Fail to do so, and your enemies will build for you and send you the invoice. That's why his closing note was a warning and a challenge. Use this moment to learn through doing for our collective survival. In a world ruled by predators, a weak nation is destined to vanish. Only the strong endure. And in today's reality, nuclear powers hold the strength to shape their own destiny. They will never lose a war, and that's not just a slogan, it's reality. We can study nuclear bombs, isotope fission, and energy release all day, but the real question is, can we actually use that knowledge when it matters? That's why this moment is crucial. You are the key to our nation's survival and growth. Traoré wasn't speaking in poetic metaphors or lofty ideals. His words cut like steel because they're pure truth. In global politics, weakness isn't forgiven, it's exploited. The world doesn't pity weak nations, it strips them bare. It sells them protection and calls it aid. And when that fails, it replaces their leaders, burns their systems, and rebuilds them with new puppets in place. That's what Traoré meant when he said, "No one negotiates with a beggar." Power isn't about smiling in front of cameras or claiming moral high ground, it's about real capability. And right now, Africa's lack of strength makes it a buffet table for foreign powers, from France to the US to the EU, who come not to respect it, but to extract, control, and manipulate. This is why Traoré refuses to play the game of fake optimism. He doesn't sugarcoat Africa's situation by saying we'll be fine. Instead, he warns, if we stay weak, we will be broken. He understands something most elites pretend not to, that the West only respects what it fears. And currently, it fears none of Africa's institutions, armies, or industries because they're either underdeveloped or foreign-owned. You can't stand up to the IMF when your food supply depends on their fertilizer. You can't defy a military superpower when your weapons come from their factories. You can't demand fair trade when your ports, currencies, and supply chains are in the grip of your former colonizers. Weakness in one sector becomes a choke point, and Africa has too many. That's why Traoré rejects foreign security deals, turns down donor aid, and focuses on building a self-sufficient military not because he's anti-world, but because every ounce of dependency is a crack in the wall. You don't need to invade a country that relies on you, you just need to cut off its lifeline. That's the quiet control France and its allies have perfected. Traoré is breaking that cycle. Africa must train, must arm, must produce, becoming untouchable not in theory, but in reality. Because in this world, the only thing worse than being poor is being poor and soft. And here's the thing: when Africa starts getting stronger, when it starts calling out the roots of its weakness, the empire panics. And when a system built on control starts to panic, it doesn't go quiet, it screams. Just listen to the French president Emmanuel Macron. Every other sentence is about how young Africans are being influenced by Russia or misled by foreign media. Every time the alliance of Sahel states is mentioned, it's coded in propaganda. They can't go a day without talking about Burkina Faso or AES because it terrifies them. They spin lies, distort history, and rewrite Africa's story to fit their agenda. But here's the shift: they're losing control of the narrative. People are waking up. They see through the manipulation, they recognize the agenda, and they're no longer falling for the same colonial script. And that, more than anything, is what scares the empire. They've been able to twist reality, turning lies into truth so much that many young Africans don't even know their own history. How? Many realize that our grandparents fought wars as cannon fodder, only to be killed like animals? Or that when France tested its first atomic bomb, it placed black soldiers in the lethal blast zone just to see what would happen. This is all documented in archives. The crimes committed against Africa are endless. That's why this history must be taught to the youth, because too many remain in the dark, still supporting imperialists and believing their words and actions are genuine. Maybe they receive small benefits in return. Maybe they simply don't know. But Africa must wake up. This is also part of the fight. When Burkina Faso started rejecting foreign troops, refusing aid, and securing its own borders, the Western media reaction was immediate. Overnight, headlines painted the country as unstable, authoritarian, or military-run. Reports focused on fear, not facts, and Traoré understands why. The script was already written. A poor, landlocked nation could never survive without France's military or the World Bank's loans. But when Burkina Faso proved them wrong, when it began building, defending, and inspiring others, it became a threat. Not to its people, but to the empire's illusion. Because if Burkina Faso can succeed without the West, so can Mali, Niger, Congo, Chad, Togo, and Guinea. That's the nightmare for the neo-colonial system, an African country proving it doesn't need them. That's why they're lying, not from ignorance, but from strategy. Burkina Faso isn't the only target. The very idea of African autonomy is under attack. The goal is to isolate Traoré, discredit his leadership, and plant seeds of doubt in African minds. If they can't remove him by force, they'll destroy his image, make him seem reckless, dangerous, or unstable. This is information warfare, and most Africans don't even realize they're on the front lines. That's the deeper warning Traoré gave. People are waking up, but many still believe the stories they're fed. They trust headlines from France 24, BBC, or RFI more than they trust their own eyes, ears, and communities. This is the colonial legacy. Even when the troops leave, the narrative stays. And that's the final trap. The empire's most powerful weapon is no longer its army, it's its story. Burkina Faso now stands as a symbol not only of resistance, but of narrative-defined sand. That's why the smears won't stop. Traoré's message is crystal clear. Don't wait for foreign media to tell you what's happening. Experience it, see it, think for yourself. Because the last stage of liberation isn't physical, it's mental. So, are you still waiting for the West to save Africa? What happens when a poor nation proves it doesn't need its colonizers? Let us know in the comments. Will you keep believing their headlines or start writing your own? If you want more content that explores the untold truth of Black history, culture, and civilization, subscribe and hit the bell icon. We're telling the stories they refuse to tell. Until next time, stay aware, stay proud, and stay free.